Local thugs harassed an old veteran, but then he called his biker friends. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of crickets as Daniel Reeves, a 72-year-old Army veteran, guided his pickup truck down the empty highway. The road stretched before him, a dark ribbon illuminated only by his headlights. Daniel had spent the evening with an old war buddy, reminiscing about days long gone, battles fought, and brothers lost. It was the kind of night that left a man feeling both full and hollow at the same time, grateful for the memories but haunted by the ghosts of the past. As he pulled into Mike's Gas and Go, the familiar neon glow cast an eerie reflection on his windshield. It was late, too late for most folks to be out, but Daniel didn't think twice about stopping. He'd been coming to this gas station for years. It was a routine stop, a quiet place where he could refuel, grab a coffee, and be on his way. Tonight, however, the quiet was deceptive. Daniel climbed out of his truck, stretching his stiff joints. The air smelled of gasoline and asphalt, and the distant flickering of a faulty streetlight gave the place an almost cinematic feel. As he reached for the pump, the deep bass of blaring music rattled the windows of the small convenience store. A car, a black, beat-up sedan with tinted windows, swerved into the lot, its tires screeching against the pavement. Daniel barely glanced up. Rowdy kids, they were everywhere these days. The car parked haphazardly near the store entrance, and 4 figures climbed out, their silhouettes dark against the buzzing fluorescent lights. They were young, maybe early 20s, leather jackets, hoodies, cocky walks. Daniel sighed. He had seen their kind before. Boys playing at being men. He continued pumping gas, minding his own business. But his military instincts, the ones that had kept him alive in jungles, deserts, and hostile territories, told him something was off. One of the young men stumbled toward the convenience store, laughing as he shoved the glass door open with unnecessary force. The others lingered outside, lighting cigarettes, laughing too loudly, eyeing Daniel's truck. He could feel their eyes on him, sizing him up. A predator's gaze. Daniel finished fueling up and reached for his wallet, but just as he did, one of the thugs stepped forward, blocking his way. "Hey, old-timer," the leader sneered, smirking as he flicked his cigarette onto the ground. Daniel exhaled slowly, his grip tightening slightly on the gas pump handle. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The kid, early 20s, shaggy brown hair, mean eyes, grinned wider. "Yeah, actually," he said. "I was just admiring your truck. Pretty nice ride for a guy your age." The others chuckled, stepping closer. Daniel knew what was happening. This was the setup, a simple intimidation game. They'd test him, see if he flinched, backed down, or ran. But Daniel Reeves didn't flinch. Not in war. Not now. One of the thugs, a tall, lanky one with a scar on his cheek, walked up to the truck and ran a hand over the hood. "What's a man like you doing out this late?" he asked, voice dripping with mock curiosity. Daniel took a slow step forward, his eyes hard as steel. "Just passing through." The leader chuckled and nudged the scar-faced one. "You hear that, boys? Just passing through." He reached out and slammed his palm against Daniel's truck, making a loud thud. "What if we say you're not passing through?" Daniel's jaw tightened. The last thing he wanted was trouble. But he also knew that walking away now wouldn't change a thing. These kids weren't looking for a conversation. They were looking for a victim. One of them leaned over, his eyes catching something shiny on Daniel's truck. The Army veteran plate. His smirk widened. "Hey boss, check this out. Army guy. Think he's got some old war stories?" The leader scoffed. "Yeah? What war, Grandpa? The dinosaur wars?" The group burst into laughter. Daniel didn't react. He just sighed and reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, not for his wallet, but for his phone. He pressed a single button. A speed dial. A name that had been waiting in his phone for years. The thugs didn't even notice. They were too busy entertaining themselves. The leader leaned in close, his breath reeked of cigarettes and cheap liquor. "Listen, old man. Hand over your wallet, and we'll let you go." Daniel finally looked up, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "You don't want to do this," the thug sneered. "Oh? And why's that?" Daniel smiled. Because he could hear it. The distant thunder. The low, rolling growl of motorcycle engines cutting through the night. At first, the gang didn't notice. They were too focused on their easy target, too caught up in their little game. But then, the sound grew louder. And closer. One of the thugs frowned and glanced over his shoulder. A dozen headlights cut through the darkness, like predators emerging from the void. Engines rumbled, deep and authoritative, sending a vibration through the asphalt. The leader's smirk faltered. "What the hell?" Daniel slid his phone back into his pocket. "I wasn't calling the cops, kid." The gang leader's face paled as realization set in. They weren't alone anymore. And the predators had just become the prey. The first thing the gang noticed was the sound. It wasn't loud at first, just a low rumbling, like an approaching storm. But it wasn't thunder. It was motorcycles. And it wasn't just one or two. It was dozens. The gang leader, the one who had been so cocky just moments ago, froze mid-smirk. He turned toward the road, his face bathed in the neon glow of the gas station's flickering sign. His buddies followed his gaze, confusion and unease settling in their expressions. Daniel Reeves stood perfectly still, his face unreadable, his eyes calm. He had been here before, not at a gas station, but in places far worse than this. Places where the enemy surrounded him, where the odds were against him, where his own survival depended on his patience, his discipline, his ability to outthink his opponent. And just like before, he didn't panic. Because he knew something these kids didn't. Help was already here. The motorcycles roared closer, their headlights piercing the darkness like a convoy of wolves closing in on their target. One by one, the bikers pulled into the gas station lot, engines rumbling like a war drum. There were at least 20 of them, maybe more. Their chrome glinted under the dim streetlights, and their leather jackets bore patches of a name that made men straighten their backs and rethink their choices. The Iron Serpent's Motorcycle Club. Veterans. Brothers. Daniel's family. The gang members stepped back instinctively, their bravado cracking. For the first time that night, fear entered their eyes. The leader swallowed hard, trying to regain control of the situation. Trying to act tough. "Who the hell are these guys?" he muttered, but his voice lacked the confidence it had before. Daniel finally turned to face him fully. "My friends," he said simply. The leader blinked. His gang members shifted uneasily, eyeing the bikers who were now blocking every exit from the gas station. They were trapped. One of the bikers killed his engine and swung a leg over his Harley. He was tall, broad, and carried himself like a man who had seen war and walked away stronger for it. His beard was streaked with gray, his leather vest was worn from years on the road, and his eyes were cold steel. He took a step forward, boots crunching against the pavement. The gang leader stiffened but didn't move. The biker took off his gloves slowly, methodically, and tucked them into his belt. Then he smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Daniel," the biker said, his voice deep, gravelly, and full of quiet authority. "You call for a ride along?" Daniel finally let himself grin. "Something like that, Jack." Iron Jack Morrison. Retired Marine Corps Master Sergeant. Leader of the Iron Serpents MC. And a man whose reputation alone was enough to make even the toughest men think twice. The gang leader wasn't laughing anymore. His fingers twitched toward his pocket, where Daniel suspected he had a knife. But he didn't pull it out. Because he knew. It wouldn't save him. Not against this many trained men. The other gang members were looking at each other, uncertain. The power balance had shifted. Moments ago, they were the predators circling their prey. Now they were the prey. And the hunters had arrived. Iron Jack stepped closer, his boots just inches from the gang leader's own. "I'm gonna ask you one time, kid," he said, voice low, calm, and dangerous. "What exactly were you planning to do to my friend here?" The gang leader licked his lips, trying to think fast. "And nothing, man," he stammered. "We were just talking." Iron Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Talking? He gestured to Daniel's truck. Because from where I stand, it looks a lot like you were about to rob him. The gang leader's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Iron Jack sighed. Here's what's gonna happen, he continued. You and your boys are gonna get back in your car and leave. Right now. One of the thugs, the scar-faced one, scoffed. And what if we don't? Iron Jack's face darkened. Then we have a different kind of conversation. Behind him, the other bikers shifted slightly, their movements synchronized, controlled. Combat veterans. Men who had seen war. Men who had been trained to break people like these thugs. The scar-faced kid realized he had just made a mistake. A big one. For a moment, no one moved. Tension hung in the air like a coiled snake, waiting to strike. The gang leader was weighing his options. He could try to fight. He could try to run. Neither would end well for him. Daniel, watching all of this, took a slow step forward. Take the offer, kid. The leader hesitated for just a moment longer. Then, with gritted teeth, he signaled to his boys. Let's go, he muttered. They turned, walking stiffly to their car. The bikers watched them like hawks, silent and unmoving. One of them tried to say something under his breath. Iron Jack stepped forward. Try it, he said, voice low. Give me a reason. The kid shut up. They climbed into their car, and the gang leader turned the ignition with shaking hands. The car backed out slowly. And then, like a frightened animal, it sped off into the night. For a long moment, the gas station was quiet. Then, Iron Jack turned to Daniel, shaking his head. You always were a magnet for trouble. Daniel grinned. You always were late. The other bikers laughed, tension easing. The gas station attendant, who had been watching the entire thing from inside, stepped out, his face pale. Man, he muttered. That was the most badass thing I've ever seen. Iron Jack clapped a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Come on, he said. You owe me a beer. Daniel chuckled, climbing into his truck as the iron serpents revved their engines. The night was still young, and trouble had just learned the hard way. You never mess with a veteran. The gas station was still humming with the energy of the encounter, the echoes of the gang's departure lingering in the night air. Daniel Reeves watched their taillights vanish down the road, but he knew the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He'd seen men like that gang leader before, young, reckless, fueled by ego. They wouldn't take the humiliation lightly. No, they'd come back. And when they did, Daniel would be ready. Iron Jack leaned against his bike, lighting up a cigar. He exhaled slowly, the smoke curling in the cool night air. His fellow bikers were still gathered in a loose formation, keeping a casual but watchful eye on the road. Think they'll stay gone? The gas station attendant, Jimmy, asked, stepping out cautiously. Daniel gave a slow shake of his head. Nope. Jimmy cursed under his breath. Man, I knew those guys were trouble the second they started showing up. They've been around before? Iron Jack asked, his eyes narrowing. Jimmy nodded. Couple of weeks now. They mostly hang around the old mill outside town, but lately, they've been getting bolder. Shaking down people, stealing from stores. Daniel exchanged a look with Iron Jack. That wasn't random behavior. Gangs like this didn't just appear overnight. They were trying to claim territory. And if they had a base at the old mill, that meant they weren't just a group of dumb kids. They were organized. And that was a problem. Daniel was tired, but experience told him tired men made mistakes. So, instead of heading straight home, he took a few extra turns, checking his mirrors, testing the roads. He didn't see any signs of being followed, but he still felt that itch at the back of his neck. The one that told him trouble was brewing. When he finally reached his property, a quiet house on a few acres, set back from the road, he took a moment to listen. No cars. No engines. Just the gentle rustling of trees in the night breeze. Even so, he left his truck unlocked, keys in the ignition. Just in case. Daniel had barely stepped inside when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He frowned, answering cautiously. Yeah? A familiar voice, low and venomous, crackled through the speaker. "You think you won tonight, old man?" Daniel sighed. He should have known the gang leader wouldn't be smart enough to let it go. "I didn't win anything, kid," he replied evenly. "I just gave you a chance to walk away. You should have taken it." A sharp, bitter laugh. "You don't get it, do you? I'm not some punk you can scare off with your little biker friends. I run this town now." Daniel chuckled. "That's cute." The voice grew colder. "You embarrass me tonight. No one does that and gets away with it." There was a pause, and then something that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "Nice house, by the way." Daniel's blood went cold. His hand moved instinctively toward his pistol on the counter. They knew where he lived. Daniel didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he grabbed his keys, his pistol, and a flashlight and moved to the side of the house, keeping low. His property was surrounded by tall trees and dense brush, good for concealment, bad for spotting intruders. The night was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Then a rustle. Daniel turned just in time to see a figure creeping through the trees. Young. Nervous but armed. The kid raised a metal pipe, probably thinking Daniel wouldn't react fast enough. Daniel proved him wrong. With a sharp step forward and a twist, he grabbed the pipe mid-swing, yanking it from the thug's grip and sending him stumbling. Before the kid could recover, Daniel had his pistol pressed against his chest. "Who else is here?" Daniel demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The kid shook his head, fear flashing in his eyes. Just me, man." Daniel heard the lie before the kid even finished speaking. Because in that moment, he caught movement at the edge of the property. Then engines. Deep, familiar. Daniel allowed himself a small smirk. Right on time. The Iron Serpents arrived in full force, their motorcycles tearing through the quiet night, headlights cutting through the trees. The thugs scattered like cockroaches. One of them ran straight into Iron Jack, who simply stuck out an arm, clotheslining the kid onto the ground. The rest of the gang didn't even try to fight. They just ran. As the dust settled, Daniel turned his attention to the kid he had caught, the one still pinned beneath his grip. "Your boss sent you here?" The kid hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. Daniel exhaled. The gang leader wasn't done yet. Iron Jack crouched beside him. "You got a choice, kid." The kid swallowed. "What choice?" Jack pointed at the motorcycles. "You tell us everything you know. Or we take a ride." The kid paled. He knew exactly what that meant. All right. I'll talk." Daniel glanced at Iron Jack. It was time to take the fight to the source. As the bikers secured the property, Daniel stood on his porch, looking toward the dark road ahead. This wasn't over. Not yet. The gang leader had made a fatal mistake. He'd declared war on the wrong man. And Daniel Reeves didn't lose wars. The night was thick with tension as Daniel Reeves stood on his porch, the cool metal of his pistol still warm in his grip. The Iron Serpents had secured his property, their motorcycles forming an impenetrable wall around his house. The thugs who had tried to ambush him were either gone or tied up, trembling under the scrutiny of battle-hardened veterans. But Daniel knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. Iron Jack approached, his broad frame casting a shadow over the wooden steps. He took a long drag from his cigar before speaking. "We can't keep playing defense, Daniel." Daniel exhaled, nodding. "I know. We need to hit them first. Hard." Jack cracked his knuckles. "Then it's time to visit the old mill." The gang's hideout was a rundown paper mill on the outskirts of town, abandoned years ago. According to the kid they'd caught sneaking around Daniel's property, the gang had converted it into their headquarters, a place where they stashed stolen goods, planned their intimidation tactics, and threw their wild, lawless parties. It was also where the gang leader, Dax Carter, ran his operation. Dax. Daniel rolled the name over in his mind. It didn't mean anything to him yet. But by the end of the night, that would change. Inside Daniel's garage, a war council formed. The Iron Serpents stood around a dusty workbench, using an old road map of the town to plan their approach. "We can't just roll in loud," Jack muttered, pointing at the map. "We need to be smart about this." A younger biker, Flint, crossed his arms. "Why not? We outnumber them now. Let's go in and handle business." Daniel shook his head. "Numbers don't mean anything if you walk into a trap." The room went silent. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? Dax Carter wasn't a fool. He had sent some of his boys to bait Daniel. But why? To prove a point? Or to lure them into something bigger? Daniel leaned forward, tapping the map. "We send in a small group first. Scout the area. See what we're dealing with. If they have reinforcements, we pull back and regroup. If not, we take them down." Jack nodded. "Sounds like a plan." And just like that, the trap was set. But who was walking into it? The convoy of motorcycles rolled down the highway, their headlights slicing through the darkness. Daniel rode with Jack at the front, his gut twisting with unease. Something felt off. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed too still, the road too empty, or the sense of being watched. He checked his mirror for the third time. Still nothing. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't the only ones on the hunt tonight. When they arrived at the mill, the place was eerily quiet. Too quiet. The building loomed over them, its rusted walls and broken windows making it look more like a haunted house than a gang hideout. No guards. No gang members in sight. Daniel's grip tightened on his pistol. Something was wrong. Jack held up a fist, a silent signal for everyone to hold position. Daniel and two others crept forward, moving toward the entrance. The door was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, the mill was a mess. Empty beer cans, broken chairs, and graffiti-covered walls. But no sign of Dax or his men. Then Daniel saw it. A table. With something placed neatly on top. He stepped closer, his heartbeat pounding as he recognized what it was. A military patch. Familiar. Too familiar. His own unit's insignia from his time in the army. His blood turned to ice. Jack noticed his reaction. "Daniel, what is it?" Before Daniel could answer, laughter echoed from the upper level. And then a voice, cold, amused, and far too familiar. "Long time, old man." Daniel froze. He knew that voice. Dax Carter wasn't just some punk gang leader. He was one of Daniel's own men from decades ago. A soldier. A traitor. Before Daniel could react, the room exploded with movement. Men hidden in the rafters jumped down, weapons drawn. The sound of gun slides racking and safeties clicking off filled the space. They were surrounded. Jack and the other serpents outside barely had time to react before trucks pulled up, blocking their exit. Dax Carter stepped forward, a satisfied smirk on his face. He was older than Daniel remembered, mid-40s, hardened by years of crime, but the eyes? Still the same. Still dangerous. Still filled with betrayal. "Bet you weren't expecting me, were you?" Dax said, pulling up a chair and sitting down as if he had all the time in the world. "You look good, Daniel. Real good." Daniel said nothing. Because in that moment, everything clicked into place. Dax wasn't just leading a gang. He was running something bigger. And now, Daniel had walked right into his hands. Iron Jack's voice cut through the tension. "So, this is your big plan, Carter? Lure us out here and trap us like rats?" Dax chuckled. "Not a trap, gentlemen. An invitation." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "For what?" Dax leaned forward, his smirk widening. "A business arrangement. You see, Daniel, I don't want you dead. I want you working for me." Silence. Jack tensed beside him. "You've lost your damn mind." Dax ignored him, keeping his gaze locked on Daniel. "Think about it. Your old crew back together. The bikers, the gang, combined forces. And if I refuse?" Daniel asked. Dax's smirk vanished. He gestured toward the men surrounding them, all armed, all waiting for the order. "Then we kill every single one of you." Daniel felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Iron Jack, the serpents, and the town they'd sworn to protect. The gang wasn't just some group of punks. They were organized, well-connected. Dax was a ghost from Daniel's past, a man he had once trusted, a man he had thought was long gone. And now, that past was staring him in the face, demanding an answer. Accept the deal and betray his people? Refuse and risk getting everyone killed? Dax grinned. Tick-tock, old man. Make your choice. The air inside the old mill was thick with tension, the smell of oil, sweat, and gunpowder lingering as Daniel Reeves stared down the ghost from his past. Dax Carter, the man who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him in war, who had sworn oaths and shared battle scars, was now the one with a loaded gun and a twisted smirk. Daniel had seen a lot in his time, but nothing cut quite as deep as betrayal. Dax leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, still grinning. You gonna say something, Daniel? Or are we just gonna stare at each other all night? Daniel took a slow breath, keeping his face unreadable. Never thought I'd see you again, Carter. Figured you died in some back alley years ago. Dax chuckled, shaking his head. Nah, old man. I learned how to survive. Adapt. You always did think you were better than me, didn't you? Daniel didn't take the bait. What do you want, Dax? Dax's eyes gleamed. I want a deal. Jack and the rest of the Iron Serpents stood tense, ready to pounce if necessary. The gang members surrounding them were armed, but they weren't trained like the Serpents. Still, the numbers weren't in their favor. Dax tapped his fingers on the table, enjoying the moment. You've got two options. You and your biker buddies work for me. Join my operation, bring me new business, and in return, you get protection, power, money. More than you ever had as a soldier. Jack scoffed. And if we say no? Dax's smile flickered, replaced by something colder. He snapped his fingers. One of his men dragged in a hostage, a young man, barely out of his teens, blood on his lip, his hands tied behind his back. Daniel's stomach dropped. It was Jimmy, the gas station kid. This one? He was asking too many questions after you left, Dax said casually. We figured he was one of yours, so we brought him along for insurance. Jimmy looked at Daniel, his eyes full of fear but not broken yet. Dax leaned back again. So here's the deal. You work for me, he walks free. You refuse? I put a bullet in him first, then I start picking off your serpents one by one. Daniel's jaw clenched. You're really going to kill a kid just to prove a point? Dax shrugged. People need to learn that I don't give second chances. Jack took a step forward, fists clenched. If you so much as touch that kid... A gun clicked, and suddenly, Dax's right-hand man had a pistol pressed to Jimmy's temple. Clock's ticking, Daniel, Dax murmured. What's it gonna be? Daniel's mind raced back decades to a different time, a different battlefield. He and Dax had once been brothers in arms, fighting in the desert, watching each other's backs when the world turned to hell. But then there was that mission. That one mission that changed everything. They had been ordered to hold a position while evacuating civilians, but Dax had abandoned them when the firefight got too hot. He'd left them to die. 5 soldiers didn't make it out that day. Daniel had barely survived. And when he got back to base, he found out Dax had deserted. Disappeared. Until now. Daniel's fingers curled into a fist. He wasn't going to let this traitor win. Daniel took a slow, deep breath. He had to think fast. Dax had numbers, but his men weren't professionals. They were thugs, opportunists. They followed him because they feared him, not because they believed in him. And fear was a weak foundation. Daniel's eyes met Jack's for a fraction of a second. Just enough for them to communicate everything they needed to say. Jack gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. And then Daniel made his move. In one motion, Daniel lunged forward, flipping the table over. Dax's men reacted too slowly. Jack grabbed the nearest thug, slamming his fist into the guy's jaw. One of the serpents tackled Jimmy's captor, knocking the gun away. Chaos erupted in the mill. Gunshots blasted through the air, But the serpents fought like trained warriors, using the cover of darkness and the element of surprise. Daniel took out 2 gang members with quick, precise blows. Military training trumped street fighting every time. Dax, realizing he was losing control, grabbed his own gun and aimed at Daniel. Bang! Daniel dodged just in time, the bullet grazing his shoulder. He rolled behind a crate, his own pistol raised. Dax snarled, ducking behind cover. "You just don't quit, do you?" Daniel smirked. "Nope. Never have." Jimmy, now free, was shaken but uninjured. "Kid, get out of here!" Jack ordered. "No way!" Jimmy protested. "I can fight!" Daniel grabbed him by the collar. "Not tonight, you can't." The serpents fought their way toward the exit, forcing Dax's men into retreat. More gunfire. More chaos. Dax cursed, realizing he was outmaneuvered. He made a break for the back door, escaping into the night. But Daniel wasn't letting him go that easy. As the remaining gang members scrambled to escape, the serpents mounted their bikes. Daniel didn't hesitate. He jumped onto Jack's spare bike, roaring after Dax. The high-speed chase tore through the backroads, tires screeching, dust kicking up in the headlights. Dax's black SUV swerved dangerously, trying to shake them. But Daniel had locked onto him like a hunter chasing prey. Jack rode beside him, eyes blazing. "We end this tonight." Daniel nodded. "No more second chances." Dax was running out of road. Up ahead? A dead-end cliffside. Daniel revved the throttle, his grip tightening on the handle. "You can't run forever, Carter." And he meant it. The roar of engines shattered the stillness of the night as Daniel Reeves gunned his bike, his grip tightening on the handlebars. Dax Carter was running out of road. Up ahead, the old highway twisted into a dead end, leading straight to a cliffside overlooking the river. Daniel and Iron Jack weren't letting him escape this time. Dax's black SUV fishtailed, its tires screeching as he tried to shake them. His gang was either dead, captured, or running for their lives. He was alone now, just like he had been the day he abandoned his unit in battle. And Daniel was about to make him face the consequences. "End of the line, Carter!" Daniel shouted over the roar of the wind. Dax's SUV swerved violently, slamming into a guardrail. Sparks flew as the metal screeched, but he managed to stay on the road. Then, suddenly, he braked hard. Daniel had only seconds to react. He skidded, jerking his bike sideways, narrowly avoiding slamming into the back of the SUV. Jack veered off to the right, kicking up a storm of dust and gravel. Dax threw open his door, stumbling out of the vehicle, a pistol gleaming in his hand. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed toward the cliff's edge. "You don't have to do this, Dax!" Daniel called, stepping off his bike. "It's over. Surrender now, and maybe you get to live." Dax laughed bitterly, wiping sweat and blood from his face. "Surrender? You think I'm going to rot in a cell for the rest of my life? After everything I built?" He waved his gun wildly. "I should have killed you when I had the chance, Reeves." "You had your chance," Daniel replied coldly. "And you ran. Just like you're running now." Dax's face contorted with rage. "Shut up. You don't know what it was like. I was there," Daniel shouted back. "I saw those men die because of you." Dax's hands trembled. The gun wavered. His eyes flickered, filled with years of guilt, rage, and desperation. Behind him, the cliffside crumbled slightly, loose gravel tumbling down to the rushing river far below. There was nowhere left to go. Jack took a slow step forward, his hands raised but ready. "Carter, listen to me," he said carefully. "You pull that trigger and you're done. One way or another." Dax snarled, his eyes darting between them. "You think I'm afraid to die?" His fingers tightened on the trigger. Daniel moved first. Bang! A single gunshot echoed across the night. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, Dax staggered. His pistol clattered to the ground, his fingers unable to hold it. He looked down at his chest. Blood blossomed from a clean, center-mass shot. His lips parted in shock as his legs gave out beneath him. Jack caught him before he could tumble off the cliff. Dax gasped for air, his breath shallow, his body trembling. His eyes locked onto Daniel's. You really shot me." Daniel holstered his pistol. "You gave me no choice." Dax laughed weakly, a wet, broken sound. "Guess you finally got me, old man." "No, Carter," Daniel said quietly. "You got yourself?" Dax closed his eyes. His body went still. And just like that, it was over. The Serpents arrived minutes later, their bikes rumbling like an army returning from war. Jack straightened, shaking his head as he looked down at Dax's body. "Waste of a life," he muttered. Daniel exhaled, his hands steady but his heart heavy. He made his choice. Flashing lights appeared in the distance. Sirens howled as the police and DA finally arrived, too late to stop the fight but just in time to see the aftermath. Chief Roberts stepped out of his squad car, taking in the scene. His gaze flickered between Dax's body and Daniel. "Hell of a mess, Reeves." Daniel nodded. "Had to be done." Roberts sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yeah. I'll deal with the paperwork." Behind them, the Serpents were rounding up the last of Dax's men, handing them over to the authorities. Jimmy, the gas station kid, was standing with them, his hands still shaking from the night's events. He caught Daniel's eye and gave a shaky smile. "Thanks, Mr. Reeves. You saved my life." Daniel patted his shoulder. "No, kid. You saved your own. You stood up to them. That takes guts." Jimmy's smile grew a little stronger. As the sun rose over the town, the events of the previous night felt almost like a distant dream. The Serpents had returned to their clubhouse. The gang was gone. Riverstone was finally safe again. Daniel sat on his porch, his coffee steaming in the crisp morning air. Jack sat across from him, flipping open a newspaper. "Looks like they're calling it a violent gang takedown." Daniel smirked. "Is that what they're calling it?" Jack chuckled. "Sure beats two old bikers clean up the town by accident." Daniel took a sip of coffee, enjoying the silence. But then, the sound of an approaching motorcycle. Jimmy pulled up on a small, old-school bike, looking a little awkward but proud. "Told you I'd learn," he said with a grin. Daniel nodded. "Not bad. You keep practicing, you might just survive on the road." Jack watched Jimmy park and smirked. "Thinking of making him a prospect?" Daniel considered it. Maybe. But for now, he was just glad the kid was still breathing. As the sun climbed higher, Daniel leaned back in his chair, listening to the peaceful sounds of a town finally free of fear. Dax Carter was gone. The gang was dismantled. And Daniel? He was still here. Not just as a soldier. Not just as a biker. But as a man who refused to let evil win. He had fought his last battle. And this time, he had won.